Hello, friends. Welcome back to Club C Club's podcast. I'm your host, Jess, and today we continue on with our DAO Contributor series with prolific DAO Contributor Chase Chapman. Chase is a contributor to Index Coop, Orca Protocol, Rabbit Hole. Pretty sure she contributed to Forefront, and I'm sure there's a few others in there as well. But importantly, Chase is also the host of the Otherside podcast, a podcast that is, well, really quite incredible, and I'm sure this conversation will convince you that you should go give it a listen. My conversation with Chase blew away my expectations. We went deep into the weeds, challenging current narratives of DAOs, explored what it looks like to enter and join a DAO as a contributor and how we might make that process better. And Chase specifically spent some time talking about how cities and citizens might be the best way to think of DAOs and token holders. And we unpack what that means. So much to get into here. You're going to enjoy. So let's dig in. Chase, welcome to the Club Pod. How are you doing today?
I am wonderful. I'm excited to chat.
This is a long overdue conversation. I think we both sort of started, actually, I think your podcast started a little bit before the Club podcast did, or even around the same time. And we sort of saw these amazing explorations sort of in parallel in different directions. And the intention has always been to kind of like do the crossover. So I call this one the great crossover episode. No better topic for us to cross over with than the mini series of DAO contributors, given the fact that you are a rather prolific DAO contributor. Let's start off the bat with brief introductions. Who are you and how do you describe what you do?
I have no idea how to describe what I do, and it changes every day. I'm not sure I ever really convey it properly, but I typically start by talking about DAO contribution. So I'm a contributor at Index Coop. I also am a little bit of a contributor at Rabbit Hole. In the past, I've helped contribute at Forefront. And I also started a developer tooling company a couple of years ago that I'm now more of an advisor to, but I'm still involved a little bit in how they're thinking about DAOs. And then I have a podcast. And I'm also doing some contributions and research at Orca. So there's just a lot of things going on, a lot of different things, but most of them are DAO related. I probably think way too much about DAOs.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. Let's maybe start at the beginning. Like, what was your onboarding moment into DAOs? How did you kind of get into this space?
It's interesting because I was working in crypto for a couple of years on developer tooling, on thinking about more broadly how to make it easier to build in this space. And that's a very different bubble from the DAO bubble and the crypto Twitter bubble. And so in the summer of 2021, or spring, summer-ish, I graduated from college, and again, I had been working on developer tooling for a while, and got exposed to some people who were working in and thinking about DAOs, and kind of fell down the little DAO rabbit hole. Like, I always liked econ, and I was like a Model UN nerd type person, and it was just like the perfect convergence of all of those things. And so I started getting involved in Forefront and Index Coop. Those were my first two DAOs, which were amazing experiences. Felt this sense of freedom in DAOs. Like, I could bring whatever I wanted to an organization and see how it reacted and kind of play around with what I thought work could be. And that was really appealing to me. And then I was like, oh shit, there's a lot that DAOs don't have figured out. And that sent me very much down this, I don't even know what I would call it, a journey of trying to find really good mental models for navigating the space. And I think that's very much still my approach of participating in DAOs. For Index Coop, that's very much around like creating a space that's diverse and equitable. And for Rabbit Hole, it's more of like a community vibe. So a bunch of different things, but ultimately my lens has been, what can we learn from existing orgs? And how can we take that into DAOs? Because we act like everything we're doing is so new, but people have been organizing for so long. There's a lot that we can learn. So that's kind of been my approach so far. And I haven't really looked back. I've thought about DAOs like consistently all day, every day since falling down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I can identify with that deeply. There sort of seems to be these two types of contributors that I'm seeing within DAOs. And I often use the word like monogamish versus monogamist. So focus on one DAO and go deep versus, apply one's skills across multiple different DAOs. In my analogy, that sounds kind of weird, but we're going to stick with it. I'm curious, like, how have you sort of thought about that? Because you sort of said about this idea of freedom and the ability to sort of do many different things. Do you sort of see those dichotomies exist, or is there one that's better for others or for some people than others?
I feel like what it really comes down to is, are you and again, I'm going to use Web2 analogies that aren't perfect, but I think it's good to think about it. Are you a freelancer who's good at something and can provide that skill across different organizations? Or are you going really deep in one organization? And I think that framing is really useful for thinking about how, when you come to an organization, you not only position yourself and like communicate that, but also how you think about focus. So I think that's very in line with what I've seen across DAOs. I think one of the major aspects of that type of work and how you engage with it that matters a lot is, if you're going to do something that's more freelancey or across different DAOs, it's going to be a lot easier if you can either build that skill set, make it very clear, and have like a very expected set of deliverables that you can keep up on. Or you have special projects that don't require a lot of context, which matters. Because like, you could be a freelancer who works on something that's a very specific skill and gets really good at it, but if it's really high context requirements, then it's going to be way harder to do that across orgs. So I think it's really about like context, whether or not that's a need across different DAOs, how much you can benefit from aggregating insights from practicing that thing across DAOs versus going super, super deep in a given DAO. But that's totally a pattern that I'm seeing. And I'm definitely not a monogamist when it comes to work, which is a fun, I think, thing to explore.
I love this because you're a great example of somebody who's taking sort of like the opportunities that are inherent or very natural within DAOs and really run with it to some great success. Can you maybe highlight or give us a bit of a window into like what your day-to-day looks like working across those orgs, or maybe even specifically for Index, Rabbit Hole, or the projects you're contributing to right now?
Yeah, I feel like day-to-day is weird because it varies, but in a week, the projects that I work on, so yeah, Index, Rabbit Hole, Orca, Decentology, which was my company, and then the podcast. And effectively what it looks like is doing very specific like meetings and thinking around my own little special projects. I've learned again that like lower context things, if you're doing it across lots of orgs, is very much required. And the amount of time that you spend on something, ideally, you're not spending that time trying to get context, because then that's time that you're not doing actual work. So for Rabbit Hole, that looks like doing Twitter Spaces, which is more community building. We've been experimenting with like some speed dating, which helps people in the community meet each other, all of that kind of stuff. And then for Index, that's like attending meetings that are like leadership level meetings, also thinking about community meetings, and then doing like one-off Twitter Spaces and meetings for planning different initiatives specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's my focus within Index. So we're doing like a Jedi training, which is sort of like DEI, but with a justice focus, with an org called The Ready, which I'm a big fan of. So planning all that kind of stuff. And then like advising, is also meetings. I guess it's a lot of meetings, but it's also going back to the drawing board and like putting pen on paper. That's one of the big things that I personally spend a lot of time doing, especially as someone who's not technical. It's a lot of like, okay, writing out what we're going to do. With Orca, it's been exploring how we can build operating systems. So it's like, how do we create a governance charter? Let's write the governance charter. Let's talk to people in the community and see what they think. So that's a lot of the nature of the work that I do. But yeah, I think it definitely depends on what your skill set is. But for me, it's mostly meetings, research, and then Google Docs or Notion.
I love that call out around context. I usually talk about it in the terms of just like the immense challenge of information asymmetry that exists just because there's so much happening. And even if you're full-time focused on one thing, I truly have a hard time keeping up with all the things that are being built and done and decisions that are being made within C Club. And so, yeah, thinking about how you go apply that across multiple different organizations is daunting. And I think it's where a lot of people kind of maybe bring judgments or critiques to that sort of type of work, and that, a lot of valuable work requires you to go deep. But at the same time, there's an incredible value for these sort of connectors. And if we're thinking about DAOs as kind of being these, we're not building our own silos or little islands, making sure that there are people that are sort of cross-pollinating through various organizations is actually a very, very valuable role. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we actually structure organizations so that we have a mixture of like the folks that are going deep and being very core heartbeat owners of like the delivery that we're trying to create here at C Club, but then also for us, how do we stay in touch with not only our projects, but then of course the broader ecosystem?
Yeah, and the other thing that I've noticed that's really useful here, if you are working across different projects, is if you're lucky to find collaborators who are really high context, who essentially help you get up to speed. So like for Index, one of the people that I work closely with is Meg, and she's amazing. And one of the things that she does, like very explicitly, we decided this, is ops and keeping up with everything that's happening. Whereas I'm a little bit more on the side of like events and doing these specific things. And so I think a lot of the power there too is finding people who have the context, and if they are good with it, helping you gain that context when it's necessary and not have to think about it when it's not. So I think people there too, and creating relationships that help you gain context is super valuable.
Yeah, our team leads, we call stewards at C Club, that's their core role, is to build context for their growing sort of contributor network. And I think that's a really great call out. This sort of like going from zero to contributor, I think is a really interesting piece to look at. And I think you often hear it from like the terms of DAO onboarding. As an individual who's sitting here, maybe listening to this podcast thinking, wow, I want to test the waters. I want to be a part of an organization. How should people think about that? It seems like this big, challenging, sort of frictionful thing to get in, but then at the same time, it's maybe not. How are you sort of advising your friends and loved ones who want to get involved to DAOs?
I wish my loved ones wanted to get involved in DAOs. That would be amazing. I think you hit the nail on the head that it's big and intimidating and seems hard, but it's also this narrative that it's easy to become a DAO contributor is definitely quite common. I've been thinking about this concept a lot more broadly because when you think about like DAO org design, let's flip the question on its head. If you're a DAO and you have certain work that needs to get done, you can either have current contributors do that work, and a lot of DAOs like very much still need talent to come in and do that. Some of them don't, and they're sort of like, holy shit, we have enough people. We don't really need more people, but technically we're supposed to be permissionless, so we'll say you can join us. And then other DAOs like really do need work. And so I think what we're seeing now, and part of the reason that this tension feels really challenging, is that every DAO is at a different stage with the demand that they have for work based on what they're trying to do, and the supply of people that want to work there. And so I think when we think about onboarding, one of the big questions is like, what work needs to get done and how can we find the right person to do this type of work? And there's some work that's pretty straightforward. Let's say video editing, which is how I originally got involved in Forefront. That was something that's just like, there was a bounty for it. I stepped up to do it. And then people at Forefront were like, hey, would you want to do more video stuff? And I was like, sure, that sounds fun. And so because Forefront was early, that was very feasible. Now they have an application process and it's quite different. So I think when you're thinking about what you want to do and joining a DAO and all of these things, it's really important to consider the stage that they're at and like the sheer number of people that are going to be applying or trying to work on something. So an earlier DAO is probably going to be a lot more permissionless, which seems counterintuitive, but I actually think a lot of DAOs early on adopt a much more, hey, anyone can come into the Discord and do work type mentality. And then when you get enough people who want to do that, you're like, oh no, we actually need a process for figuring out who's doing work and who's not going to be able to get paid for work that they're doing just because we don't have a demand for that. So I think considering the stage is really important there. Later stage DAOs are probably going to have a more formal process for joining. That's not always true. Some of them don't really have any idea what's going on. But for an organization like Index or others, I think one of the big things is about going to meetings if they're open and just seeing what needs to get done, like listening in, starting to chat with people, and slowly kind of stepping up and finding the people who can help you sense make and find the right opportunities. Other DAOs have bounty boards. Like I think every DAO has a very different approach, but I think reaching out to people regardless in the DAO, not spending all of their time without doing any research, but reaching out once you've done your research and tried to figure things out, people are probably going to be the ones who are going to point you in the right direction. So I think that's a really big aspect of all of it.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's this sort of narrative around DAO onboarding that assumes that DAOs have almost like this unlimited desire to onboard people, and that the challenge is really a lack of clarity on information, maybe like the need to gather more information to simplify onboarding is something that's more effective than just dropping people into Discord. And I think there's truth to all of that, but the true friction that at least I feel as somebody who's, deep in the operations of these DAOs is that we have things that need to get done and we have talent, and the matching of those is never one-to-one, right? Like there's always an imbalance somewhere. And we're lucky in that we have a lot of talent coming in, and our frustration is how do we go put those people to work effectively, especially as the organization is growing. But I think this idea that open permissionless DAOs want to grow to millions of people, and how do we get everybody in and onboard them effortlessly is just completely missing the point. And it leads to this belief, I think, that from a contributor standpoint, that it should be easy to get in. And, I think one of our collaborators sort of pointed out that, like, what if we looked at DAOs as actually like the most interesting DAOs being the most compelling in-demand jobs possible? So like what that might be like, so for a business school person, that might be an investment banker. Think about all the hoops people have to jump through to go and get that incredible job. I think if you're sort of thinking like, I am competing with a lot of people, this is something that I want to be a part of because I love the mission and there's an economic opportunity and I can go build a career here. Those are the type of people that are actually going to be effective at making it in and through. And somebody who's taking a lot less of a focused, direct approach is just kind of going to get lost. And I don't know if that's good or bad or whatever, but it is, I think, kind of the state. And there's this misguided or sort of misunderstanding, I think, of like that top level goal that DAOs are trying to solve that leads to more complications for people to join.
Yeah. And I will say the other element of this is I think a lot of people have this critique of an application process and a permissioned system, partially because it feels like, well, DAOs should be open to everyone, and creating the same systems as Web2 just creates sort of like the same problems, where like you might have certain careers where people from different backgrounds like definitely are not able to access as easily as people from other backgrounds. And of course, you have like race and gender and all of these things that play a role. I think the other way to look at that, though, is that if you don't have an intentional onboarding process where you're trying to curate a group of people, you probably end up having the same issues, because you sort of just put everyone in a room together and you're like, hey, everybody, just start working for us. I don't know what that means. You're going to end up with a group of people that probably doesn't look exactly the way that, if you care about really intentionally thinking about background or skill set or whatever, like it's very unlikely that by not curating those people, you get the group of people that's ideal for your organization. And so I think we need to be a lot more open to what that really looks like and means, and consider that to find the most ideal group of people, like you do have to do curation, and anyone can join a community. I think keeping that open is great, but not everyone's going to be able to get paid for contributions that they make, especially if they're contributions that they just come and make without checking and seeing if that's something that's even going to get compensated. Like that's a sort of weird narrative that seems to still be common, where it's just like, oh, go to a DAO and start doing whatever work you think is necessary and, somehow get paid for it. It's like, if you did that with any company, that wouldn't work. Nowhere does that make sense, because that suggests an unlimited demand for any kind of work that just it's not possible.
That's interesting. I often wonder, these conversations are challenged by the fact that the term DAO means so much and nothing at all. And so it's like any meaningful conversation needs to start off with a definition and maybe some sort of like gradient between like decentralized and not, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of open permissionless broad networks is extremely exciting, and amazing things are going to result from those type of structures. And we talk about bankless guys, Bitcoin is a good example of this, like even more sort of decentralized and autonomous version of it. And so that narrative, I guess, is broad, accessible, shared financial incentives allow for this emergent behavior, and cool shit happens. And yes, cool shit happens. Some downsides with it as well. But I think a piece that's like less explored, but potentially more impactful, is this idea of high leverage organizations. And you think about what is software done and what does smart contracts do. Yes, in one sense, it allows you to have sort of social scalability and having to trust so many people, and you can kind of grow human coordination much bigger, which is without a doubt exciting. I'm not suggesting it isn't. But on the flip side, it's like, well, what has software allowed us to do? It's like small teams like WhatsApp was able to go sell something for $1 billion where there's 11 people working for them. And I think we're seeing this too with like, say, a party DAO, right? Like 7, 8 contributors creating an exceptional amount of value there. Does it benefit from having an unlimited number of contributors in there? Probably not. So I think we're going to see these organizations that still use the same tools, same language, same intentions, but are being, for whatever, like the nature of their business, maybe they're developing product, at Seed Club, not helpful for us to send 1,000 people to work with early stage projects. This is not helpful. They need the right 5 people. And so depending on where we're going, but I think we're going to see some extremely valuable, extremely impactful organizations that are rather small number of contributors, definitely very permissioned, manage culture quite a bit, but are really trying to like do what most organizations do and just get the absolute best, most aligned talent you possibly could find. And I think that's interesting. I think that's going to result in some cool things.
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to this idea that permissionless work is not the core fundamental thing that makes something a DAO. It can happen. That's very possible, but it's not really the fundamental thing. I think it's ownership and ability to have a say in certain types of decisions. Like, I think that ultimately, even something like Seed Club, where you can have a community own it, is really powerful, regardless of how you decide who's going to do the core work of what Seed Club fundamentally does. It's interesting to like start to draw those lines, because the analogy I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I got this from Rafa from Mir, who's a wonderful human. I was talking to him about how DAOs are kind of like cities, and he was saying, every city needs a mayor and all of these things. And it's been framing a lot of my thinking around what it really means to have a community-owned project, platform, whatever it is. Because ultimately what you're asking is, who are our citizens that are helping govern? And there are things that mayors and other people that work for a town do, and citizens don't need to agree to it or vote on it or whatever. That's fine. We can figure out what that means and what those things are as a community. But at the core fundamental level, I think it's really a question of who are the citizens and how do you give them the power to govern? And a lot of times what that's going to look like is you give a very small group of people the power to govern and the power to hire people who also are going to help govern and run the actual city that needs to get run. But also acknowledging and building a space for citizens, I think, is a really interesting way to think about all of this. Because citizens don't care about running the actual town. They're not approving building permits, and they shouldn't be. And I feel like in DAOs, for some reason, we're like, oh no, people should be approving building permits and doing sewage checks. And it's like, probably not.
I love that analogy because it's something that we've been thinking a lot about as well, where there's sort of this tension between citizens and operators. And DAOs, I think, feel, and probably rightfully so, the need to cater to both those groups and probably many more as well. But I think it is incorrect to think that you would cater to both those groups in the same way. And I think what's interesting when we think about contributors, right, DAO contributors, often we're thinking about DAO operators, people in our core teams, but there is also this sort of like contributor as citizen that I think you're getting at here. And I'm curious, what do you see as like the doing, like what is the making, the participating look like on a citizen level?
So I was talking with Danny Zuckerman and David Phelps at ETH Denver, and Danny blew my mind about this because I've been really trying to, in my mind, grapple with this question of delegating power to experts and people who know a field really, really well, and giving power to citizens, people who are, whether it's token holders or all of the contributors and people within the community, like however you define a citizen. And Danny said something that I'm totally going to botch, but it was really interesting, which is basically like, you kind of have two ends of a spectrum and you need to balance it. One end is all power is given to experts. And the problem that you end up with there is that what experts decide on is not always going to be what's best for the people that they're governing, for whatever reason. Like, it doesn't matter if that's because they just haven't been forced to take those people into account. Like, if you think of like a monarch basically says, you're in charge of this because you're an expert. Like, if their mandate doesn't come from the people, then you're going to have this weird situation where they might do things that aren't actually best for people, or they can get bribed. You have all these different challenges. On the other end of the spectrum, total populism doesn't work, and it's not good for anyone because you don't have expertise, you don't have specialization. Often the populace is not choosing decisions that are the best ones, and so that doesn't work either. And so what Danny was sort of saying is like, what you want is experts who serve the people and are given their power by the people. That way, they're constantly balancing an act of saying, okay, I am going to make a decision based on my specialty and my expertise, but I have to also take into account the people that I am here on behalf of and making decisions on behalf of and given power from. And so by putting people in that like balancing place, you end up with something that feels a lot better. My basic, and this is definitely not the entire thing that citizens should be doing, I don't think. I think there's more than that, but I think one of the main ones is giving different people the power to make decisions on behalf of them and holding those people accountable. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot of orgs that are like, hey, we're going to delegate power to you to do this, and we're going to delegate these people this power. And that's going to be interesting. What I am anticipating is going to happen is there's not going to be enough transparency around those things. I have already seen this happen in orgs. And the problem is that second piece of accountability matters a lot too. So there's delegating, and then there's holding people accountable to doing the things that they said they were going to do or acting on behalf of the people. And I think that's like the piece that's going to be really, really important, because from there, you end up having people who are able to make decisions for the group, who are able to think about those trade-offs and be transparent about those trade-offs. And citizens can keep following those things. Like, this is also why I think content around governance is going to be really interesting. Like, you've already seen certain DAOs have podcasts about governance forums. I think that's really cool. But yeah, to me, those are some of the really important aspects of what citizens can do. I'm curious if there are other things that you think would fit in there.
Yeah, I mean, because I think, like, again, depending on the type of organization, like that citizen, like one of the role of citizens would just be living their lives, right? And so what does living your life within in that DAO look like? And I think for maybe service DAOs, maybe Index, maybe there's like a lot less hanging out going on there or value through there. I don't know enough about it, but I'll just make that broad assumption. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Whereas maybe on a flip side, you look at something like Friends with Benefits, which is very much a social club, and like the core thing is just kind of living your life and getting the benefits of the education. Maybe that's more a member, and I think citizen is almost somebody who's taking more of an active desire to participate in the civic life of an organization. Where I get hung up in my head a little bit is like, well, how do we actually... Maybe they look more like a board, right? So it's like a cross between like the populace and a board, where they're in charge of, like, your DAO will be stronger the more competent your citizenry are, the more thoughtful your citizenry are. And so how do we think about onboarding new people into that type of role, or at least incentivizing that? Because inherent to contributing in DAOs is this idea that you sort of earn ownership, at least in my worldview. But do we have a similar sort of structure for people who are maybe not coming in to contribute on a work type basis, but that would fill a good role of like citizen or governor participant? So I don't have a good answer for that.
I think using platforms is the other thing. By existing in FWB, you're basically using it and you're giving it value. If no one existed there, it wouldn't matter. And it's interesting because I feel like there's been a lot of discussion about who should be a recipient of an airdrop in a lot of the airdrops that have happened. And a lot of platforms have, of course, chosen to give users a large portion of airdrops. And so I do think this question of like, are you a citizen of ENS by using ENS? And is using ENS actually part of what makes you a really good citizen is an interesting question. And there's a lot of debate, or some debate at least, about whether or not that's true and to what degree users quote unquote create value. I personally think that users should be recipients of airdrops. I think that they do create value, but I think that would probably be, that to me is like my spin on exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting debate. And I think like most things, it's probably both. It's the yes and type thing. Mm-hmm. I think you had a wonderful tweet, seems very relevant to this conversation. And I'm just going to quote you because that's fun. Lots of orgs outsourcing work to their communities and calling themselves a DAO. I'm not a fan of gatekeeping terminology, me neither. But if you're going to say you're a DAO, please give your community real power. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what was the intention behind that, and why is it so important, do you think, to draw that line?
I see two different things happening right now. One is companies that are progressively decentralizing. And two is orgs that started off as DAOs, realized that decentralized work was hard, and sometimes fall back to centralized structures and hierarchies. What I'm learning when I'm talking to people from The Ready, which is like a self-management consulting company I'm a huge fan of. I know you've listened to Brave New Work, I think. They have a great podcast. Anyway, I've talked with them a lot, talking with people who are like experts in sociocracy. I'm learning how much it is true that if you want the benefits of decentralization, you actually need to take on some of the things that are scary. Having this like decentralization as a means of signaling that you're decentralized but not really being decentralized is something that I think happens a lot in this space because we think decentralization is a virtue. And I think that's fine. But there are actual benefits to decentralizing as an organization. And I think that in an effort to make people think we're decentralized, we're like, oh, we're a DAO, we're decentralized, blah, blah, blah. But there's this lack of true power in a lot of communities that I'm seeing where companies that are progressive decentralizing or DAOs that have sort of swung far more to the centralization side end up kind of using their community as outsourced freelancers who they can like throw a bone to make them feel engaged. And I just think that's not the vibe. I mean, I think first of all, we do that because people don't fully want to give power over, which I completely understand. It's like you've built this little town and now you have all these citizens who have come in and you're like, oh, do I trust you to make decisions and have control over my baby? I don't know. And I think that's very okay. But I think a lot of communities or I suppose like core teams or leaders or whatever need to sit with that discomfort and at least acknowledge that a lot of them are not giving control to a community because they're scared to do that. One of the things that Aaron Dignan on the Brave New Work podcast said that like has always stuck with me is that they see this a lot in companies that want to be more self-managing, where they'll have managers who are like, yeah, everybody's on this boat and I just need everybody to like paddle harder, you know, like I just need everybody to work harder and this will all be fine and I'll tell them what to do. And it's like, no, you need to give them all speedboats, but you don't want to do that because you're afraid of what that would look like. And I think that's, again, like totally okay. But if you're going to call yourself a decentralized organization, you need to be giving your community speedboats, not like tossing them a paddle and being like, technically you're doing work. And I think that's where, to me, drawing on self-managing orgs and all of the stuff that they've done at the Ready and, you know, Sociocracy for All and others is really valuable because they see this happen all the time and they're not helping organizations decentralize just to be like, oh, we're technically decentralized. They're doing it because there's an economic business case for giving people the autonomy to do their own work and not have hierarchical structures. And so they've done a lot of like the human thinking about how to do that. Whereas I think we're very much coming from like a protocol decentralization approach where it's like, well, Bitcoin is decentralized and permissionless. We should just try to emulate that. Humans are not computers though. So like you need better systems for doing that. But yeah.
So my spicy take of the week that got a bunch of attention is the tweet that I sent that said, we need more DAOs, not more DAO toolings. And I think underneath that is exactly what you've, I think, more eloquently described here, which is that we are not computers. It is not technology that's limiting our ability to really be effective in these organizations. I think it's failure of imagination and great examples on one side, and also like a failure to really bring the learning that we've had over the last number of decades through so many different types of organizations, and big fans of the Ready as well, around self-management, et cetera, to figure out the complicated human stuff, right? Which is like, how do you bring people together? How do you get aligned? How do you make decisions? How do you, and I love that idea of like the oar versus the powerboat, because yeah, like if you truly believe that you have incredibly talented people and you truly believe that you have this big goal, adventure, mission to go achieve, why would you not give people the most powerful tools possible? Well, the reason we wouldn't is fear or other human things that we need to kind of address. So I think that's like probably DAO onboarding on one side, and like this idea of Yeah, like what is it that's actually the limiting factor in the growth of DAOs today? I think are just completely misinterpreted by folks that are not deep in the space. And if we can just get our heads around that and start solving those hard problems, we're going to see a lot more progress.
And this is also, I think, back to this question of onboarding and choosing people. You don't want every single person to have a speedboat. Like, you do want people who you know are aligned with your values and necessary for the org to do X, Y, and Z. Like, you need the right people to have a speedboat. And I think that's where these two very commonly held beliefs around permissionless work and I want to be decentralized, but not really, sort of come and kind of conflict with each other / are each other's problem. Like, this is a self-fulfilling, not good cycle, because people don't want to have more selective power delegation, let's say, or just be more selective about who has a speedboat. And so they don't want to give people speedboats. Rightfully so. Like, you don't want to give speedboats to every single person who's doing anything ever. But I think it all comes back to that. So to me, like, a lot of the stuff is really about kind of like personal hygiene, but for orgs, where it's like, if you don't solve one problem, you create this other problem that makes this other thing not work. And I think we need to be thinking really deeply about a lot of these things and experimenting with different things, because otherwise we can't build on foundations in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, I think this idea I've been toying with and I get a variety of opinions on it, and it's super interesting in your take. I think there's like the product that a DAO might be building, and then there's the DAO. And I think it's probably helpful to look at both of those as products, or at least the places where innovation will create value. And I think to your point, yeah, like the failure to solve or to address organizational issues, they don't go away. And they become limiting factors. And if I look at least what we're building at C Club, is we're building a network. It's a sense-making network that projects plug into, contributors plug into, and collectively we're incentivized to do good for those members. But our job is to sort of build that network, and that means many different things. But one of those is definitely like this focus on helping us collectively work better. And if we do not invest in and think about and continuously put sort of resources towards trying to reduce that friction, or at least become more effective, we're not going to be able to create a valuable network, and we're not going to be able to sort of achieve the big goals that we're after.
Totally. And the other thing that I think people don't think a lot about is that when you join like a traditional hierarchical org, you don't have a say in how things are run. You don't have a say in everything that's going on. And I think a lot of people mistake the conversation around DAOs and structures and all of that kind of stuff for sort of like useless meandering, or just like thinking about all of the things that are going on and just like, I don't know, I've seen on Twitter, like philosophizing for no apparently good reason. I think a lot of this is actually incredibly useful. And part of the reason is that what you're seeing is large groups of people who have never had a say in how their organizations are run or designed finally having a voice and coming to their own conclusions. And I think that's really powerful. And the fact that we're doing it out loud together builds this narrative that you actually do have the power to make decisions within your organization, to have a say in how it's sort of structured. I don't know. I think that there's something really amazing to that I hope continues, because sure, like, I think people need to be doing work. I think a lot of people are doing work. And if you just want to like hypothesize about DAOs, I think that's fine. You're probably not going to get paid by a DAO for doing that anyways, unless you're specifically doing org design work, which I think there's a lot of value in. So it's a really interesting narrative that I'm seeing pop up a little bit that I don't necessarily think is quite the way to think about it.
Putting that into context is probably important, because if you think about the sheer volume of human beings, the percentage of human beings who are working in hierarchical structures versus who are not, it's massively disproportionate. And so like we have a long way to go in thinking out loud together to even get to remote parity with sort of the amount of experience that has been had in these hierarchical structures. So yeah, I think like the work of exploring that intellectually and practically is incredibly valuable. And for those of us that are sort of in the ecosystem and in the echo chamber, it's probably going to seem very loud and repeating. But I think keeping that in mind, that there's sort of this like adoption of DAOs will necessarily have more space, more voices going through that process of self-exploration in the broader context, and that is ultimately good, and we should probably be encouraging that and creating more space for it.
100%. Because what happens if we don't do that and don't have open conversations and don't articulate not just why these things matter, but how we could potentially see this through, I think what we end up with is falling back to hierarchy because it's what's familiar. Like, I think a lot of decentralized organizing is really uncomfortable for people because you don't have some boss to point to or CEO to be like, oh, they're the ones making the wrong calls and that's affecting me. Instead, it's like, no, we're all supposed to be owners and we all have a voice. And if this system sucks, it's our place and our responsibility to fix it because no one's going to fix it for us. And I think that's really, really uncomfortable because you have to sit with it and you also have to find the solutions for it. And if we don't have conversations about how we do that and the fact that we're doing that, I think what we end up doing is falling back to hierarchy because it's just what we know works. So we're like, oh, we got to get this thing done. Let's just do X, Y, and Z. Because most people have been trained for decades to work that way.
So we've sort of been experiencing this in various ways as our team sort of grows and thinking through like decision making and how do we navigate the complexities of trying to make sense with a growing team and a growing level of complexity that exists in our business more generally. And what we found is actually be incredibly powerful is structure. And I think there's almost this misbelief that structure and hierarchy are the same thing. And I think they very much aren't. They can be. And I think the default is that they are. Reticence to have an org chart in C Club, when I look back on it now, is just like huge mistake. Absolutely huge mistake. The power that has come from having a quote unquote org chart, which doesn't look like it. There's a lot more circles in this org chart than you would have in a traditional org chart. I think that's all DAO org charts. But just having that sort of like, this is what I am responsible for. This is how it fits into the broader things. And then clarifying specifically that that structure is about facilitating getting work done. And our stewards are about helping to facilitate that work getting done, not the decision maker or boss, etc., has relieved a lot of pressure and tension and back and forth within our team. And yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on structure as an essential part of being a contributor or sort of building a DAO.
I have two favorite analogies for why structure matters. One comes from Ted Rao, who wrote a book called Many Voices, One Song. And the fundamental thing there is just like, if you're singing a song with a bunch of people and you're all singing a different song, that is not going to go well. It's going to sound terrible and you're not really singing a song. Everybody's singing something different. And so I think a lot of structure is about making sure that everybody's singing the same song. The other one that comes to mind is playing a game where there are no rules, which just creates chaos. Like, again, if you have no idea you don't even know what game you're playing, there are no rules, then you're not going to get any type of emergence. Emergence only comes from when everybody has agreed on the set of rules for the game. You consent to those set of rules effectively by playing the game. And then people have the ability to think about strategy and all of these different things. But without a basic set of rules, you have no thing to go off of, and you're not going to actually have any quality of emergence that's interesting. And I think this is the big thing that people just completely miss. Like, they think that emergence comes out of pure decentralization and absolutely no structure. And Aaron Dignan, again from the Brave New Work podcast, is like always sort of sounding this alarm that is just never the case. Like, emergence only comes when you have enough structure that is the sort of foundation that these things can blossom from.
Yeah, there's a great book called Finite and Infinite Games that is broad exploration and philosophizing on this topic. So if you haven't given that a read, top 10 read in this sort of general direction. I'm curious, so coming up on the hour here, I look to you as somebody who has really just dove headfirst into being a contributor into DAOs. You're an entrepreneur, you have this I'll go figure it out type vibe, which I think it makes you successful at whatever you go to. But I think one of the big roles that we have as early contributors is trying to make the path for future contributors a lot easier. And when we talk about structure, we talk about solving some of the basic problems. We had Patty from FWB on just talking about the barriers of not having healthcare or clarity around how to do healthcare. There's all these sort of things that are being solved. I'm curious, like, what is the magic wand that or if you waved your magic wand, what do we solve to make it easier for the next batch of contributors to really lean into the DAO space?
I've been thinking a lot about how important it is to articulate or explicitly state things. And I think one of the most important things that you can state to people who are joining an organization, and I think also there's a Brave New Work podcast episode about this. You can tell I'm in my like serious obsession with Brave New Work phase. Anyway, onboarding is uncomfortable when you're doing it into a self-managing organization, again, because you don't have a boss, you don't necessarily have someone to guide you. I think those are all things that like DAOs can get at in some way. But I think acknowledging up front that moving and shifting your mindset into one that's required for a self-managing org is not easy, and it's going to be kind of painful is really valuable. Because otherwise people go into an org and they're like, oh, amazing, I can do whatever work I want, I can get paid for doing it, this is like fantastic. And the reality is that none of that's true in the way that you would think it is. Like, yes, those things are true, but not quite. And I think being very open and honest about those caveats and about the discomfort, frankly, of onboarding yourself, because no one's going to onboard you, into these orgs is one of the most important things. Because then when I go in and it kind of sucks, I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to feel this way. A very simple example of this that I absolutely loved, but that is kind of unrelated, but somewhat related. When I joined FWB, the welcome message was like, hey, we have a lot of channels. It's going to be very overwhelming. Mute them all except for a few. By saying that up front, they took away this feeling of like, holy shit, I should be keeping up with all of this stuff. And I think it's the same way with self-managing orgs. Because even if I'm overwhelmed or even if I'm uncomfortable from onboarding myself, I can be like, oh no, it's supposed to be this way. This is okay. And I think that matters a lot more than we realize.
Absolutely adore that answer. I think that's such a useful framing. And I think we can even extrapolate that out broader to the entire space and say like that managing expectations is such an important thing for anybody who's taking even a leadership or a vocal role in this space today, because the deeper you are in the world, the more that sort of reality you've just explained is apparent across the entire structure, right? It is awkward, it is challenging, there's still friction, things aren't figured out, we're still within this broader gray area of operating. And I joke all the time just about how my brain breaks daily just trying to figure this sort of stuff out. And so I think as this wave crashes, right, or sweeps us up, I think we're in the sweeping up phase of DAOs, it's very easy for people to think that more things have been figured out. And so I think the reality is that more things haven't been figured out. The work to be done today is to be a part of figuring it out. If that doesn't appeal to you, probably not the thing to go jump into just yet. Give it a few years and your skills will probably be very valuable over here. I think a lot about that, because if we go back to, I don't know, when we first met and you think about how the world has changed from then till now, it is very, very, very difficult to wrap your head around.
Oh, yeah. And if you are sold on a version of reality that's like so different from the actual version of reality that exists, I just think it's a much more painful process. Whereas if you recognize or are told at least like 80% of what's actually happening, at least you can go in and kind of like consent to the idea that you're going to immerse yourself fully in that reality. Because no one really does Web3 like kinda. You sort of either are like curious or you're like, oops, this is my personality now. And so I think like being very upfront about what that entails is very powerful. Otherwise, it's just like, it's not pleasant for anyone.
The insight that is wrapped up into that one kind of funny but very deep statement of no one does Web3 kinda, I think is immense. And I love that a lot. Chase, this conversation has blown my mind in many different ways. I had high expectations. You completely crushed them. Where can people find out more about you? And can you please, please, please plug your podcast?
Well, I appreciate this. This has been a very fun conversation. I'm on Twitter at Chaser Chapman. So there's like an R in between. My middle name doesn't even start with an R. I just like goofing. And then I have a podcast called On the Other Side, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that stuff. Jess, you were one of my first guests, so we'll have to do a follow-up conversation. I'm finishing up like a DAO mini series right now, which is funny. We're both doing mini series at the same time. But after that, I'll have to have you on because this was so fun to chat.
Amazing. Chase, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us, and highly recommend On the Other Side, and just give Chase a follow. She thinks out loud, works out loud, and there's an immense amount of value that gets shared on a daily basis, and some spicy takes. We like the spicy takes.
Sometimes we're here for the spicy takes. Yes. Thanks so much for having me on, Jess.
Thanks, Chase.